Welcome to Grapple Arts Radio.
Hey everybody, today I'm really happy to be talking to Brandon Wolverine Mullins. Brandon is one of the hardest working and very well respected grapplers active in North America today. He's got a whole list of medals from judo, from freestyle wrestling, and especially gi and no-gi Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm super glad that he took a moment out of his busy training schedule, you'll see just how busy it is, to talk to us and answer some of the questions that the readership of grapplearts.com had for him. So, Brandon, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Stephan. Thanks for having me on.
Now, you've dedicated years and years and years and a huge part of your life and a ton of energy to training jiu-jitsu and finding what works for you. And as part of that, you compete an awful lot. You put yourself there in the crucible and test it to make sure that it works. And I also know that you're about a week out from your next tournament. So why don't you take us through where you are in your tournament preparations and what you've already done today to get ready for that tournament?
So today is not a light day, but this next week is going to be still a lot of training, but a little bit less super intense training. Now it's more to kind of maintain my weight and also to get rid of those last few pounds. I'm kind of hovering between 125 and 126 right now, which is where I need to be a week out. But today, all I did, I came in and we had an open mat session at the gym here at Gracie, Baja, Texas, and I did about 30 minutes of just free training, and then I did another 30 minutes, or actually about 45 minutes of positional training after that, just to get some specific positions in and keep my sweat going and stuff like that. And then after this interview, I'll probably go to my gym and do some running as well as a kettlebell workout too.
Cool. Well, we're going to totally go over your competition training routine and what you're doing specifically to get ready. But just introduce people to you. Why don't you talk a little bit about your background and how you got into this crazy sport of rolling around on the ground, trying to twist people's arms and make them say uncle, and talk a little bit about what led you to this path of combat sports.
Okay. My progression was basically wrestling, judo, and then Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the way that it started was I'm from Texas, and when I was going into the 8th grade, that summer we moved to Oklahoma, and I would eventually stay there for 2 years. My dad, he worked in the oil company, and he got transferred. And I came home one day. It was school hadn't started yet. We were kind of settling into the new house, the new neighborhood, trying to meet people and stuff like that. And I remember I was really excited because 8th grade was the first year that you had like electives where you could pick certain classes. I mean, everybody had to take math and science and this kind of thing, but you got to pick like if you wanted to do, art class or shop or whatever, and you could do sports as well. And I was really excited about, going up to the school and signing up for my classes. And I mentioned it, and my dad was like, "Oh, we already did that for you." And I'm like, "What?" I wanted to do that. And he goes, "Yeah, we signed you up for wrestling." And I'm like, "I'm not doing wrestling." And he goes, "Yeah, you are." And my dad is pretty, kind of like authoritarian, He's pretty my way or the highway kind of a guy. And he he actually forced me to wrestle. And no amount of pleading or crying, and there was crying, would change his mind. And so he basically forced me to do it. And his whole intent was just so I could to do something new, to toughen me up, which I definitely needed. And also he knew that I would make friends playing sports, and I did. And so that's how I got started with kind of grappling sports in general. He basically forced me to do it. And after, a month or 2 months, once I kind of got used to the other kids trying to just murder me on the mat, I would get paired up with some newer kids, and I realized that I realized what technique was basically. And that was what changed the whole experience for me. I realized that as a smaller person, if you do things correctly and you use the principles of leverage and technique, then you can beat bigger people. And that was incredibly cool to me as a little kid, and as a figuratively and literally, I was a little kid. I wasn't that big. I think I wrestled at 75 pounds when I was in 8th grade, and I had no trouble making the weight. I remember I would be eating on the scale or something, and all my friends who were cutting weight would be, cussing me and this kind of thing. So that's how I kind of got started, with combat sports and this kind of thing. And then I think it was the off season of my 9th grade year, we had an off season wrestling coach. His name was James Tickett, and we showed up for class one day. And normally we would just kind of do whatever. We would go play basketball, we would lift weights, or we might do some things that were related to wrestling, maybe not. We may have to go work out with the cross country team or something like that. But this day he brought in a TV, and we're like, oh sweet, we get to watch a movie. And what he popped in the VCR, if you know what a VCR is at this time, he put in the first UFC number 1, and we got to see Hoist Gracie, beating up all those people, and the karate guys and the boxing dude with one glove, and the kickboxer guy at the end. Mm-hmm. And when it was over, we really didn't know what to expect. We didn't really, I think we were in 9th grade, so we didn't really know what we had just witnessed, and after it was over, he was like, all right, we're going to do this. And we all kind of looked around, and we were like, we have to fight each other? And he's like, no, knuckleheads, we're gonna learn how to do this submission stuff. And I don't know where he had learned what he showed us, but basically what he showed us was kind of a submission grappling style. He showed us all the basic submissions, and then a few sweeps. I remember we learned the scissor sweep and the double ankle sweep from the guard, and we learned what the guard was, and we learned arm lock and guillotine and kimura and basic foot lock. And, you're pretty Americana arm lock and these kind of things, just the basic submissions. And then we just mixed it together with our wrestling. And what really made me keep Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or that submission wrestling style in my mind was that we always did no time limit matches, because that's how the UFC was.
At the time, yeah. Yeah,
there's no time limit, no weight class. And when he would make us train, that's how it was. It was no weight class and no time limit. And I remember that the kids that would demolish me in a 6-minute wrestling match, or in a 20-minute wrestling positional training match or whatever, I could beat those kids. We would have like a 30-minute or like an hour-long marathon match, and eventually I would submit them. And I remember there was one kid in particular that he was my friend, but he was a really, really good wrestler, and he was about 2 weights above me, and he would murder me. It was horrible, And I remember very specifically submitting him with the kimura from the guard after we had been training for like an hour. And after that happened, I was just kind of like, man, this is something I want to learn more about this. And then we ended up, after that year, we moved back to Texas, and I didn't have a chance to wrestle, and there was no jiu-jitsu as well. But my next door neighbor, a guy named Jeremy Schiff, introduced me to judo, which I hadn't known about at that time. And we saw that it had submissions, and I was like, well, I know it's not jiu-jitsu, but it's close. And we started trying to teach ourselves judo, and I think there was a couple of people in town, this was in Midland, Texas at the time, that were doing some judo. And we basically just trained on this trampoline. We would try to throw each other, and then I would try to do my submissions and my wrestling. And we ended up, I can remember the first tournament we went to, we really had I didn't have any formal training at all. And I just had one match, and I double-legged the guy, got on his back, and did like a rear naked choke. But it was actually more of like a rear naked face crank, from what I remember. But I was still happy with it, with the results, and it was cool. And then I didn't get the opportunity.
So that was your first win by submission in a tournament?
That was my very first win by submission in a tournament. Rear naked face crank, which I'm not too proud to say now, but it was certainly really cool back then. But I did that for, just kind of training by ourselves for about 3 years. And then I was able to wrestle again as a senior in high school. There was a club team that I joined, and it was a really great experience. And then I wasn't able to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu until I started college. And I went to college in Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas. And I got introduced. I kind of got referred to a gentleman by the name of Clay Pittman, who was a black belt under Carlos Machado at the time. And that's where I really took off with my training. And actually, that's not correct. I did judo for a year. When I graduated from high school, we moved to Houston, and I met a person named Paul Thomas. And he was actually he was going back and forth from Houston to Brazil, and he was training with my current boss right now and current jiu-jitsu guru, Professor Draculino. And he had told me about Draculino, and even though he was teaching us judo, he was always trying to show us what he had learned in Brazil. And I think he was a blue belt or a purple belt at the time. And that was 98, I think. And then the next year, in 99, I moved to Lubbock to go to Texas Tech University. And that's where I had met Clay Pittman, started I guess you would say, my official BJJ training. And it kind of went on from there. Got my black belts in October of 2007, and moved to Brazil shortly after that for about 6 months, and then came back and, training and teaching, and here it is about 13 years later and still going strong.
That's amazing. It's funny, Brandon, because I think there's a whole specific generation of North American jiu-jitsu freaks who got their start out of the early UFCs watching Royce Gracie. I was certainly one of them, and it was that and the Gracie in action videos that came before that really inspired myself and a bunch of my fellow Kajikembo karate students to start beating the snot out of each other on the mats after class. And we didn't really know what we were doing, and we were kind of making it up as we went along and taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there. I'd done a little bit of judo, another guy had done some jiu-jitsu, Japanese jiu-jitsu, and it was, I think there's a lot of other people who started jiu-jitsu 13, 15 years ago who were basically inspired by that whole era of backyard guerrilla videotapes.
Yeah, I think, people got a hold of the first UFC, and there wasn't a lot of other material out there on the market, and people just were like, they knew they wanted to do it, but they didn't know how. They weren't able to do it because there wasn't an instructor, or they didn't know how to contact anybody, and so they just kind of learned what they could, like you said, from judo or wrestling or wherever, and they just started going at it, and eventually, avenues for training opened up. And it's funny you brought up the Gracie in action videos. When I first started teaching at a jiu-jitsu school, showing those Gracie in action videos was actually part of our introductory lesson. And what's funny is people would actually walk out. Like we would put the video on, and then we would just we'd be doing office stuff or whatever until it was over, and we would get up and they would be gone. Those people fighting on there, and they would see it. The beginning of the video has like the lion taking down the gazelle and all this kind of stuff. And it freaked a lot of people out, man. It's really funny.
They didn't know what they were in for. They thought,
man, they had no idea. And I guess they always saw themselves as the gazelle instead of the lion. And they just got the hell out of there.
Okay. So has the competition always been a strong focus for you? I guess with wrestling in high school and wrestling in grade school, that is the point. So I guess you were introduced to competition early, and that's remained a focus for you.
Yeah, I always competed. Like you said, in wrestling, it's different than jiu-jitsu in that, like, jiu-jitsu, you kind of practice for the sake of itself. But in wrestling, you were always practicing so you would go to compete, go to the tournament. That was always the goal, to go to the tournament and see how you did, or to win, or whatever. And judo was more like jiu-jitsu. So when I started doing wrestling, it was all about competition. I mean, you wrestle and practice so you can go to the competition. And then when I started doing judo, I did the same thing. It was like, for me, it was kind of like, well, when do we go to the competitions? And some people were like, what are you talking about? And other people were like, oh yeah, we're going to go this one this weekend or that weekend or whatever. And I can remember, driving all over Texas and sometimes the nation, trying to get in judo tournaments here and there. And then when I started doing jiu-jitsu, was the same thing. I always felt like, even though I enjoyed wrestling and doing judo and doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu for the sake of themselves, I always felt like competition kept me motivated, whether it was motivated to continue to train hard because I was winning, or whether it was motivating to make me train harder because I was losing. Either way, I felt like it was a benefit for me to compete. And I've always done it since, like I said, I was about 8th grade.
Do you get nervous? And I guess the associated question is, did you used to get nervous before competition?
Man, I always got nervous. I still do. And I can remember my very first wrestling match was like a street fight. I thought it was like a fight, and I went out there, and that's what I did. I just fought as hard as I could, without throwing any punches or anything. And up until all through wrestling, all through judo, and up until I was like into my purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I would have a match and I would come off the match and I would ask my friend, like, what happened? And they were like, what? And I was so, like, pumped up on adrenaline, and I was so, like, I guess into the moment, all I was doing was reacting. And so I didn't really have a whole lot of memory of the match. I usually remembered the first thing that happened, and then I remembered, like, the last thing that happened. But in between, it was kind of like a haze because it all happened so fast, and I was just kind of reacting to the situation. But now I'm much more calm, and even though I still get nervous and I still get anxiety and I still get that adrenaline, I think over the years, I just, as with any person who's competed for a long time, you learn how to deal with it. You learn how to you're used to it, and you just learn how to kind of use it to your advantage as opposed to letting it get in the way and slow you down or make you freeze up.
Well, that's interesting, but you're the exception, right? You've been competing at a super high level for years and years and years, multiple competitions a year, multiple competitions a month. And I'm sure there's been weeks where you've had multiple competitions.
Oh, yeah.
So that puts you apart from a lot of the recreational level guys who want to train and maybe do a competition a year, or maybe use that competition to focus their training, in preparation to getting their purple belt, in preparation to getting their blue belt. So what advice would you have for them? Because to them, saying compete for years and years and years and eventually you'll learn how to deal with it is true, but it's not really super useful. So what advice would you have for them that they can use right away that would help them for doing that one competition a year, say?
One thing I would say is, first of all, I would recommend that everybody competes. At some level, as long as they're training jiu-jitsu, they should compete at least a little bit, once a year, once a month, once every 6 months. I think it's great, like you said, to focus your training. And as far as my advice for those kinds of people, or really for anybody who's competing, there's two things that I want to say. One is try to develop a routine, or kind of a routine, or like a trigger. Some people call it a trigger, that lets you know that it's time to get in the zone, or that actually puts you in the zone. So I'll use myself as an example. When I like to get to a tournament maybe an hour or 2 hours early, just to kind of relax and get used to the environment. But then I have a very specific, like, warm-up routine that I do, and it's not very long. It just takes me about maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but that gets me in the zone. And what I do is a very, very simple yoga routine, and I know that you do yoga, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's just called the sun salutation. It's the most basic kind of yoga stretching routine that you can do. I do that, coupled with a few other things. And once I do that, I just feel like I'm ready to go. And a lot of times I even do that before I train. If I come into an open mat, or I come into a training session that isn't a class time, I'll do that same routine. That way it gets it into my mind that after I do that routine, it's time to train, it's time to fight, it's time to go. And that kind of really gets me mentally focused on what's about to happen. I know a lot of other people do the same type of thing with listening to music. They have a certain playlist that they listen to before they fight. And one thing that I recommend is they need to incorporate that same playlist in their training. If you have if you go lift weights 3 times a week, then pick out, 3 or 4 or 5 songs. It shouldn't be like a 20-song playlist. It should be relatively quick because you may not have a lot of time to warm up. But, listen to that when you do your workout, actually on your way to the workout in your car or something, so that after you hear that song or those couple of songs, that lets you know that it's time, it just got real, so to speak. It's time to really get out there and perform, whether it's, training or competition. I think that having that routine and building up that trigger is very, very important for getting you ready, and also helping you to deal with the anxiety and the emotions and the apprehensiveness that comes with the time before the tournament.
So whether it's Rafi, Zamfir, or screaming death metal, it doesn't really matter so long as it's something familiar to you that tells your body and your brain that it's just another day at the office, and it's let's get to the optimal state of arousal, but let's not go way, way, way beyond it either.
Yeah, definitely. Some people, I listen to music too, but that's not really my cue. I mean, I definitely like to listen to headphones and stuff when I usually do that.
What do you listen to when I know you don't use it as a cue, but what would you be listening to on the way to driving to a workout? Something to amp you up or to calm you down?
I think it's more about it's about amping me up to some degree, but also making me feel comfortable. And I have a pretty eclectic musical taste, but in general, what I listen to mostly is kind of a mix of I would say punk rock, and also with some regular rock and roll and some rap mixed in there as well, or some hip hop, whatever you want to call it, mixed in there as well. And when I first get to the tournament before I'm ready to warm up is usually when I listen to that music to kind of get me, relaxed, and I definitely will get amped up with the music. And then when I'm ready to actually start that warm-up routine, normally I turn it off. Not always, but normally I do. Really, the routine is what gets me into the right mental state more than the music. The music is kind of secondary for me personally. Other people, it's more primary.
Okay.
The second thing I'd want to tell people who wanted to compete is to make sure they stay positive in their state of mind. And if you think about it, most people have a lot of visualization. If you're going to go to your job and you're going to quit, and everyone is going to be in their car rehearsing what they're going to say to their boss, how they're going to tell their boss off. Or if you're going to go to a job interview, you're going to visualize yourself, what you're going to say when they answer. Or if you're going to go on a first date, you're going to visualize the jokes and the anecdotes you're going to tell to the girl, or how you're going to set up, making your move or whatever. You're going to visualize it. Everybody does this. And so it happens when you go to a tournament too, or in the weeks or months leading up to a tournament. You visualize yourself competing or whatever. And what happens a lot of times, and what used to happen to me, is that I would end up visualizing a lot of negative things. I would visualize myself going out there and getting submitted, or losing on points, or just my jiu-jitsu kind of going haywire on the mat. And what I realized over time and through reading sports psychology stuff, which I'm a big fan of, is that whenever you visualize about the tournament, not only should you be visualizing specifically for the tournament, but even if you're just out doing your rounds for the day or whatever, and the tournament pops in your head, you need to make sure no matter what situation you're visualizing, you're thinking about, you need to finish it up with a positive thought. So if you had a bad day of training and you're at home and you're in the shower or you're in bed and you're thinking about, man, I'm going to go to the tournament and I'm going to get armbarred. Well, you need to continue that thought until you escape that armbar, reverse the position, and submit your opponent and have your hand raised. Always try to end any sort of thought about the tournament or training for that matter on a positive note, no matter how bad it may get in the midst of that visualization session or that thought. Make sure you end it on a positive note with the referee raising your hand.
So then that'll reduce the pre-competition anxiety a little bit as well, because your brain's not going, I'm going to get murdered, I'm going to get murdered, I'm going to get murdered.
Yeah, which is, I mean, those exact words have gone through my head so many times, I'm going to get murdered, I'm going to get murdered, and sometimes it would happen and sometimes it wouldn't happen. But I can tell you that when I have positive thoughts, I always do better. I may not always win the match, but I do better, I feel better, and things go more to plan than if you have those negative thoughts. So I think definitely just staying positive regardless of who you're fighting or what the situation is. Just be positive. I read a quote in a book one time, and it said, whether you think you can or you can't, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a really powerful statement. And I've experienced the effects of that in my own training and my own competition experience. And to a large degree, it's true. If you believe you're going to win, most of the time you do.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned things going according to plan. So how much of a game plan do you have? And I suppose it would change as your level goes up. I mean, initially, when you're competing with blue belt or purple belt, you don't really know who you're going to face, but you've got a pretty good idea who you might be facing in the black belt division of the World Championships. So how much of a game plan do you have, and how often do you end up following it?
A couple of the things. I basically have two game plans, really. I have a takedown game plan, and I have a guard pull game plan. And there's two. If I'm scouting an opponent, if I'm watching someone who I'm possibly going to be fighting the next round or whatever, there's two things that I initially look for. One is whether they pull guard or whether they go for a takedown, and two is what their stance is, right leg forward or left leg forward. And that helps me to determine what I'm going to do as well. If I have someone who I've never seen before and I don't know, then I may just go with whatever I feel strongest, what I've been training the most, whether it's pulling guard or using my takedowns. But I try to follow, I'm a big believer in game plans, and I try to follow them as best that I can. Obviously, sometimes things go wrong, but a lot of times things go just like you planned. I can remember the very first black belt match I ever had. It was in Brazil, and it was the first time I've been to Brazil, first time competing in Brazil, first time as a black belt, and there was all this pressure. And I can remember that, like the day before, my roommate came in with kind of a strange look on his face, and he asked me if I wanted to know who I was fighting. And I was like, no, I don't care. I don't want to know. I'm just going to go out there and do the same thing anyways. And I had learned like a new triangle setup maybe, I don't know, a month and a half before. And I was really, really excited about it. And I would think about it every single night. I would visualize myself getting into the position and executing the triangle from that setup. And like I said, for about a month and a half, I did it. And then I go to the tournament, and I think I had to buy the first round, and then I had to fight some guy I'd never heard of, never seen before, the second round. And I went out there, pulled guard, used the setup, and I submitted him in about 2.5 minutes. And I walked off the mat. Of course, I was like really excited, like I said, first black belt match, first match in Brazil. And I walk off the mat, and my roommate is kind of, again, he's giving me this strange look. And I could tell that I think he thought I was going to lose the match. And I walk off, and I talk to him. He goes, man, that guy was world champ, like either last year.
Oh, no, really?
2 years before at brown belt. He had recently gotten his black belt, which I had as well. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, man, I didn't think you were going to win. And so that was, to me, that was a really great example of how visualization and how game plans can play out exactly how you see them in your mind. That's not the first time that's ever happened to me. It's happened to me a lot of times. And usually some of the best performances I've ever had, it's because I had visualized a certain game plan or a certain strategy, and it had played out exactly according to plan. And
that's really funny. There's a quote that I love, which is no plan of contact survives no plan of action survives contact with the enemy. But you're saying that your plan of action not only survived contact with the enemy, but went exactly according to plan, which is
you
really
know what?
interesting.
It worked out for me a bunch of times. One of the first really big, I'm going to say victories, even though I got second place, but it was a really big point in my career as a purple belt, and it was the second time I fought in Pan Am's. The first time I fought, I lost in the first round. I got submitted. And the next year, I was still at purple, and I went in, and my game plan was this. I was going to take the guy down, pass his guard, get on his back, and choke him. That was my plan. And all my training had basically revolved around that. And I ended up having to incorporate some new techniques to fill in some holes, and I ended up having 3 matches that day. And the first 2 matches, that's exactly what I did. The first round, the guy pulled guard. I passed. I made him turtle, got on his back, and choked him. Second round, exact same thing happened. I think maybe I went for the takedown, and the guy kind of stuffed it, and then he pulled guard, and then I passed, got on his back, and then I choked him. And then in the final, I was on my way to do the same thing, but he ended up taking me down, which kind of screwed me up a little bit. But then I recovered, and actually haven't gotten a triangle for a long time. I ended up losing on points. I think it was just maybe like 2-0 or 4-2, something like that. And I got silver that day. But, the first part of the tournament went exactly to plan. There was no funny business or nothing of me getting off track of my plan. So I'm a really big believer in visualizing and having game plans.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the the fact that you've got two game plans. You said a guard pulling game plan and a takedown game plan.
Yes.
And given that you've got such a strong background in wrestling and in judo, and there's all these, whether you're doing it with the gi or without the gi, judo-based takedowns and wrestling-based takedowns that'll work, it's a little bit surprising to hear, well, actually when I was watching you compete, to see you pulling guard and to hear you talking about that being a part of your game. You would think that your wrestling background and your judo background would orient you towards a top game. So how do you find that the different arts, the wrestling and the judo and the jiu-jitsu, feed off each other in your training, and what's the influence of it?
Ever since I started wrestling, when I moved on to judo, I always tried to incorporate some wrestling. And then when I moved to jiu-jitsu, I always tried to incorporate that same wrestling and some of the judo as well. I really think that that's important. It's important for tournaments. I think it's important for self-defense as well. I mean, you're not going to start off on your knees in the tournament, and it's not going to happen in the fight either. And I think learning how to use takedowns effectively is really important. As far as when to pull guard and when to do takedowns, for me, it's just about the specific opponent and where do I think I have the best chance to win. Like for me, competition is relatively simple. It's kind of like a math problem. I mean, my objective is to get to a position where I feel I have the highest percentage chance of winning as soon as possible. So sometimes it's the closed guard. Sometimes it's on top passing and working for side controller back. And so to determine when I pull and when I do my takedowns, a lot of it depends on the person that I'm fighting. So sometimes when I know the person I'm fighting, I just try to evaluate how their game stacks up with my game, and then I make my decision. If I'm fighting somebody who I don't know, a lot of times because my training is consistent, but sometimes the way it works out, I'll end up doing a little bit more guard stuff or more takedown stuff. And so if I'm fighting someone who I don't know, I'll try to evaluate like their body type. Like a lot of times people who are tall and lanky are going to be more guard players, and people who are short, stocky are more takedown top players. So I really kind of use that really basic archetype to help me make my decision about people that I don't know. Also, too, I always feel like Brazilian opponents are more likely to pull guard than American opponents, and so that also influences my decision on whether I'm going to pull guard or whether. So
that would make you more likely to pull guard than to try and take them out of their element.
Yeah,
perhaps.
If I know a guy's a guard puller, a lot of times I want to do exactly that, Stephan. I want to pull guard first to put him in a weaker position. Even though he's on top, I know he's going to feel more uncomfortable. And a lot of times I do that with people who I think are wrestlers too. I have a lot of confidence in my takedowns, even though I don't always use them. A lot of times I feel like if this guy's going to try to take me down, I feel like I can take him down and put him out of his element, put him on his back, and then I'm going to be able to pass and do whatever.
So in addition to training top and bottom and having different game plans for top and bottom, you obviously do a lot of gi and no gi. I mean, one of your claims to fame is that you won the no gi world championships 2 years in a row. But I know you train a lot with a gi. So where do you stand on cross training? Do you have completely separate games for gi and no gi? Do you try and have the same game for gi and no gi and avoid collar chokes? How do you navigate that murky area of gi versus no gi training?
I really try to have a game that doesn't change much from one to the other. And I'll explain a little bit about that. Again, because I started off in wrestling, I always kind of had like an affinity for no gi. And, then I did judo, then I did jiu-jitsu, which is primarily the gi. I was also lucky at my first BJJ school, we always did no gi. Not a whole lot, but we would always have at least once a week, or in the summer times we would do a lot more no gi. So I was always exposed to no gi in addition to like my wrestling background. So I always wanted my jiu-jitsu to be able to work regardless of what the person is wearing. So to put it, really, really in simplified terms, basically if I had a selection of techniques, say I had 2 techniques for whatever situation, and one of them was applicable only with the gi, and one of them was applicable with and without the gi. And if I felt they were, both equally valid, I would always pick the technique that was usable with and without the gi. And I did this for a long time. And that definitely let me have a game that was
a transferable game.
Yes, yeah, that was really my goal. Because I enjoyed no gi. Not that I liked it more than gi. I really wanted to do no gi in addition to my gi training. But something that sometimes that interfered with that, especially in the beginning, is that I would totally avoid positions that I thought were gi dominant or gi. You needed the gi to use, like spider guard or some fancy collar chokes or anything really that used the gi. I thought too much, so to speak. But what I realized over the years is that if you're going to do both, then you're going to encounter certain situations, primarily in the gi, that don't exist without the gi. Okay, one of those examples is spider guard. Okay, or somebody controlling your pants. So obviously, without the gi, your pants aren't there. So you're not going to have a problem of somebody controlling your pants to pass your guard with like a bullfighter pass. But in the gi, you will have that. So what I learned is that if there's a gi problem, a gi-specific problem, there's no reason that you should not pick a gi-specific answer. You don't need to have your spider guard defense transferable to no gi, because spider guard doesn't exist in no gi. I mean, not really. There's certain things you can do, right, but for the most part, it doesn't. And there's no reason that your collar choke defense, no reason you can't grab his sleeve or use, some other part of his gi to defend your neck, because there's not going to be a collar choke in no gi. So that's one philosophy that I really tried to adapt, I would say, in the last maybe like 6 years, was that you need to use, it's okay to use gi answers to gi problems, because that will not influence your no gi game at all, because those positions don't exist without the gi.
Absolutely. It's like worrying about riding your bicycle and that affecting your cooking. They're separate things to some extent.
Exactly. I would say probably in my mind about 70% of the jiu-jitsu is going to overlap, but you're going to have that 30% that doesn't. That's basically going to be just gi stuff, and there's no reason you shouldn't incorporate those gi techniques to solve those or to work in those gi positions, because they're not going to negatively affect your no gi game, because they're not going to be there.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I can top that tortured analogy between riding a bicycle and cooking, but I'm just hoping we can move on and nobody will pay attention to that. Let's talk about your preparation for competition. Obviously, you've got to work your training,
mm-hmm.
In terms of your sparring, your drilling, and then your conditioning. That's how most competitors, in my experience anyway, divide their training. They do their actual live sparring, then they do their drilling and technique repetition, and they do some kind of conditioning. How do you prioritize those things, and how do you allocate a given number of hours in a day, and what does a typical day look like for you, say, right now?
I'm a big believer in getting as much training as possible. I don't really think that overtraining I don't think that's real. I think under-resting is the problem. You don't really overtrain. It's that you don't get enough rest to recover from the training. So I'm in a very favorable position because I work at a jiu-jitsu school. We have morning class and we have night class, and we have a break in the middle of the day, which is how most jiu-jitsu schools are. And so I'm able to get a lot of rest and naps when I need to, as far as, if my training picks up. But in general, I'm a big fan of drilling. I'm a big fan of positional training. And, of course, live training is important. But normally, I would say Monday through Friday, I will get at least an hour of just straight drilling, which is just me repeating techniques over and over and over at no resistance. And then most of my live training is going to come through the classes that we have at my gym. And then anytime I'm doing training outside of class, it's almost exclusively positional training, such as passing the half guard or passing closed guard or defense from the back or defense from side control or attacking side control. Just, specific positions with specific goals. And if you reach those goals, you reset. So I'm a big believer in that and doing my training that way. I think
so I might have you in side control. You get out and you put me in the guard, and we say, okay, good, break, and we'll go back to side control. We won't continue rolling ad infinitum.
Basically how I always do it is if it's a guard position, the rules are always going to be the person on top has to pass or sometimes submit you, and the person on bottom has to always sweep or submit. And if we're doing a non-guard position, like, mount or back or whatever, the person on bottom has to always recover guard or get on top, and the person on top has to, sometimes it's advance the position. Normally it's going to be they have to stay out of the guard and finish you. They got to submit you.
Okay. You do a lot of bad position training, and do you do submission defense training? Say you start in an armbar position, but your hands are locked, or in a triangle?
I do a lot of bad position training now, and I used to do a lot of submission defense training. I don't do quite as much as that as I used to do, just because it's starting to get kind of hard on my body. As far as you're in a triangle and the guy's cranking on your neck, trying to pull your head down. Even in an arm lock situation, even if you're not getting arm locked, there's still a lot of pressure on your elbow if you're locking your hands together or whatever. So I don't do as much submission defense positional training, although I used to. Now I focus more on bad positions, side control, mounts, back, and even some more specific positions that sometimes I have trouble with. But in general, on top of the training schedule I just talked about as far as drilling, positional training, and live training, I also try to have specific training goals. So when I come to class, I may have a goal of I want to work bad, I want to make sure I start off each of my rolls from a bad position. So I'll slap hands with my partner, and then I'll immediately just kind of let them pass my guard, start the match in side control. So I have to escape, recover, sweep, pass, and then submit the guy. So I definitely do a lot of training on my defense, and I think that's really important for anybody, whether you're a white belt or a black belt. You have to work your defense. I'm not a big, huge football fan, but I know a lot of times in football they say that defense wins championships, like offense wins games and defense wins championships. And I think that applies to jiu-jitsu as well. If you can't, get caught in that fire and escape unscathed, then you're just always going to burn up. And anytime the match gets into a rough spot, you're going to break down and you're going to lose. But if you're able to escape that arm lock or you're able to recover from side control, then you're able to not only get somewhat of a mental edge over your opponent, but the match is still going on. You still have an opportunity to win. And I know personally, I've had a lot of come from behind victories where I started off down on points, or the guy almost submitted me and I got away or whatever, and then I was able to win the match in the last minute or the last 2 minutes or even the last 15 seconds. It's happened to me a bunch of times. So I think doing that specific training and an emphasis on defensive training is very important as well.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about drilling and we've talked a little bit about sparring. How does conditioning fit into that, and how many hours a week of drilling, sparring, and conditioning would you do, and what are you doing for conditioning?
I don't know how it breaks down in the amount of hours, but as far as my philosophy about that, I think that doing additional conditioning work is very important, and everybody should do it, and I do it. But I think that you should never skip a jiu-jitsu class or a jiu-jitsu training session in order to lift weights or run. I think if there's an opportunity for you to train jiu-jitsu, that should be your primary goal. And then, if after practice you still have energy, you still have time, then go to the gym and work out. Go get on the treadmill and run. Get on your bike and pedal yourself to death. But I think it's important that the best way to get into jiu-jitsu shape is to do a lot of jiu-jitsu, and I'm a big believer in that. I do a lot of jiu-jitsu. I train in every single class that we have at the school here, and I'm doing additional training before class and after class as well, whether it's drilling or positional training or whatever. And then I also find time I try to go to the gym, a couple of times a week. I try to ride my bike. I try to do kettlebells. I try to run, all this kind of stuff. But one thing that I think a mistake that people make is that they will skip jiu-jitsu to go to the gym. And I think that's a problem. I think, you need to always be working on your technique. And normally the gym, as far as a weightlifting gym, is always going to be open later than a jiu-jitsu class. You can go to the weightlifting gym almost at any time. They have 24-hour gyms, but you don't have 24 hours jiu-jitsu. You only have jiu-jitsu in the morning and in the evening. Especially if I'm lucky I work at a school, so I can open up and invite people to train with me whenever I like, pretty much. But people who don't work at a school or don't have a very, very, very close relationship with their instructor and are lucky enough to have a key to a school, they have a very limited time frame in which they can do jiu-jitsu, and they need to take advantage of that. And then they need to organize their supplementary training around that jiu-jitsu schedule. I think that's important.
Okay. So it's a matter of prioritizing your training. Well, let's talk about the fact that, I don't know if there's a nice way to say it, but you're not a big guy.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that you're often the smallest person in a class.
Yeah.
And that there's teenagers who are bigger than you.
Teenagers and women.
So, from a perspective of being a teacher, what's sort of the number one piece of advice that you can give to somebody who's starting out, who's small to start with? So, a brand new beginner, day one, let's say they're 140 pounds. You can take them aside, you can give them a few minutes of advice. What would you tell them?
If I had to just tell them like an inspirational thing, I would say that your time is going to come. It may not be right now, but if you keep training hard and you follow through with the techniques that you're learning, your time to win is going to come. You know what I mean? Like, it's going to take the little guy some time to build up his technique in order to survive being smashed and having these big guys jump all over him. If I had to get more specific, there's really two things that I would tell a smaller person as far as specific things for their jiu-jitsu. One would be learn to love the closed guard. The closed guard is it's a cornerstone of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's like the first guard that everybody learns, closed guard. And there's a reason that it's the first guard that everybody learns. That's because it gives you the most control over somebody. The closed guard is the best position that you can be in if you're on bottom. And you need to learn to love that position and to get there and to be able to survive and to work from there. A person is able to freak out or spaz out the least when he's in your closed guard, because you have control of his hips to some degree with your legs. You can pull him close. It's harder for him to stand up. Even though he can, it's a lot harder, and it's much easier for you to pull him back down than, say, if you were in an open guard situation like spider guard or De La Riva or any one of these more higher level guard positions. So I think that's one of the first things I would say is, learn to love and to utilize the closed guard. It's not only going to give you control, but it's going to give you time. You're able to, I heard BJ Penn one time, he said, if you don't open, your opponent can't pass. So I think that's true. If you want to hold a guy in your closed guard for an hour, you can probably do it. And I'm sure if you're, people who are competitors have had the experience where a person did just that. They pulled guard, they went for an X choke, they got an advantage, and all they did was hold you in the closed guard for the remainder of the match. And it is incredibly difficult to open that guard if the only goal your partner has is to keep it closed. Normally you pass the guard off of an attack or a transition that the person is making. But if he just wants to squeeze you and hold, it's incredibly difficult to escape.
Yeah. And if they know how to do it.
Yeah, especially if they know how to do it, and especially if they're attacking you too, it's really hard. You got to worry about your posture, you got to worry about your neck and your elbow. You can't just stand up however you want or just put your hand between his legs and open, Everyone knows there's going to be problems. So I think that's one thing that people need to do is really develop their closed guard, learn how to be comfortable there. And the second thing I would say as far as a little guy to focus on in jiu-jitsu, I guess big people, is to really work your defense. Do that defensive training that we talked about earlier, whether it's starting in a submission or starting in a bad position.
So not always just working your attacks.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people do. Almost when people drill, they almost always drill offense. And even when they do positional training, they normally just drill their favorite positions, which is important. It's important to sharpen the saw, so to speak. But you also need to be drilling and doing positional training in positions that you don't like, because if you don't like them, I guarantee you don't like them because you're not any good at them. Mm-hmm. So you need to get good at those positions. So a lot of times I think the positional training is is important because it not only teaches you to be comfortable when somebody's weight is on you, but it teaches you how to kind of get into that jiu-jitsu ball, where you pull your arms in close, you pull your legs in close, and you're not really exposed. If the guy loses balance and he falls on you, you don't have your knee at an awkward angle, or you don't have your hand in an awkward position where he's going to break your wrist or your finger or sprain your ankle. And I think that's a problem that people don't really think about too much, is not just getting injured in submissions, but just getting injured simply because of the weight of the person you're training with. And so when you do those positional,
the big guy slips and falls on you.
Yeah, or he just, he does like a stack pass and he just has no regard for how big he is in regards to you, and your neck gets jacked or whatever. A lot of times, if you're in that situation and you believe in your defense, instead of trying to maintain that guard at all costs, particularly in a training session, you can let the guy pass. And then you're confident that you're going to be able to defend and recover. And your risk of injury is going to be much less if you are able to allow the person to do what they want to do to some degree and defend against it, hold the guy off, and then when he makes a mistake, and he will, everybody makes mistakes, you're able to capitalize on it. So not just doing the submission defense, which I think is important, but also doing the positional defense, just so you can be comfortable if you, like I said, if the guy's trying to really twist you up in a strange position in your guard, let him pass. Curl up into that jiu-jitsu ball.
The advanced fetal position.
The advanced fetal position. You know what I mean? That's a very, very, very useful skill in the training room when you're going against big, crazy training partners who are trying to, I'm sure you've had experience with like a guy who's like 60 pounds heavier than somebody trying to do a flying arm lock on, somebody who he's way bigger than.
Oh, for sure. And it's ego driven to some extent, because a lot of big guys their whole self-identity is based around being big and having spent hours in the gym and having shot up tons of steroids and being all jacked, and they're not going to let a small guy beat them, or if that's what's going through their brain.
A lot of times they will do anything possible to win, including injure you. And if you have great defense and you're able to use that, what you call the advanced fetal position, which is great, by the way, if you're able to use that effectively and like I said, kind of weather the storm, a lot of those guys will not only get tired, they'll also get discouraged, and you're going to be able to capitalize on their mistakes and get your game working. And people forget, too, that if you're worried about, if the guy passes my guard, I lose points, if you're on your side, no points are scored. He's got to make you flat. And it can be a lot harder than people think to make somebody flat if you're able to curl up in that position, you keep the crossface off. It's hard to make you flat. So a lot of times you can kind of let your guard go for a second, but you're able to recover into a half guard or a butterfly guard or to that closed guard position that I like so much.
Okay. Well, that's some really, really good advice. Why don't we just begin to wind up here? But if you are facing a big guy, what are your favorite ways to tap them out, to make them tap?
Depending on how big, but if it's like a really big guy, the answer is always to get to his back, and one of my favorite ways to do that is to do an arm drag, either off the arm or kind of a collar drag if he has the gi on. I think when you get behind a big guy, you eliminate a lot of you eliminate his bench press, which he is so in love with because he's facing the wrong direction. And, you also, his hips are facing the wrong direction to be very explosive in regards to you, because you're behind him. Everything is facing the wrong way. And so when you get behind that guy, not only can, of course, you attack him with chokes and even arm locks and stuff like that, but he can't freak out and spaz out as much as he could if you were in side control of the mount. So going against a big guy is a very simple equation. It's always trying to get to the guy's back. That's a big deal for me. And sometimes it takes a long time. Sometimes you have to use those defensive principles. You have to defend and wait and defend and wait and defend and wait, and then he gets tired, or maybe he gets overconfident because you've been in the advanced fetal position for 15 minutes, and he does something that's not the best thing, and then bam, you're on his back and you're choking him.
What about from the guard? What if you can't get to his back? What do you like to do against a bigger guy?
I like to do close guard. I said that before, but that's really, I think, you're able to control a guy and wear him down. The close guard, because you have control over the guy, it really gives you it takes the clock off, I think, to some degree. You know, if you get a guy in a different guard position, you can tire out just as fast as he can. If you have a really big guy in your spider guard and he's really trying to pass, you know, it can be very, very tiring for you to hold him off. And when you have somebody in the close guard, I think it's very, very, you know, you don't have to use a whole lot of energy because the idea of submission really isn't there. You know, he's not going to, you know, do a Kimura on you. He's not going to do an Americana. He's not going to choke you.
But you have submission options on him from your close guard.
Yeah, definitely. As he's freaking out and he's moving around, you're the one who's attacking with submissions, you know, or you're just wearing him down. So for me personally, I like to use the close guard, and I'll also use butterfly guard too because I can kind of get into a ball as well. If I can get, you know, one underhook or two underhooks, I can kind of stay in that inside space. You know what I mean? One thing about jiu-jitsu that I don't hear people talk about a lot is controlling the inside space, which is a big deal in all parts of jiu-jitsu. But I think in like butterfly guard and even close guard, you want to dominate that inside space so you're able to be defensive but also offensive. So for me personally, if I have to play the guard against a bigger guy, I'm looking to do close guard, I'm looking to do butterfly guard, and you know, I have a pretty decent triangle, so I like to use that a lot. And chokes too. Chokes are always good against big people because they can't. It's harder for them to power out. It's harder for them to resist. You know, Helio Gracie, you know, said it best. You know, no matter how big and strong a guy is, if you know, nobody can resist the choke. They're all going to go to sleep the same as anybody.
I don't think we can say it any better than Helio. So we'll begin wrapping her up.
Okay.
Now, obviously, you didn't get here on your own. You had a lot of help from teachers and sponsors and training partners. And so who would you like to give a shout out to before we go?
I like to shout out one to actually, if I can self-promote just a little bit here, to my own company, which obviously sponsors me, but it's called justgipants.com, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You know, we just sell gi pants, and it's kind of been like a brainchild of mine for a while. And even though sometimes it sounds a little bit ridiculous, if you've trained jiu-jitsu for a long time, you've inevitably come across the situation where you have like 5 gi tops and you're down to like one pair of pants. You know, so pants simply rip and wear out faster than gi tops. So I made a company that focused on just making top-notch replacement gi pants. There's a 6-month guarantee, and there's always free shipping. So if you need some new gi pants, check out justgipants.com. There's a webpage, and we also have some commercials on YouTube.
That's a really cool idea, Brandon.
Thank you. Like I said, a lot of people give me some very strange looks when I tell them about it, but once they start, usually like a couple of days later, sometimes after they rip their pants.
They're like, what's that website again?
Yeah, exactly. They say, man, that's a pretty good idea. And if you tell it to people who've been around for a long time, again, you get the weird look at first, but then they're kind of like, yeah, you know, you're right, man. I actually need new pants right now. And so I don't know the logistics on how much faster a pair of pants wears out than a jacket, but I know that it definitely happens that pants wear out faster than jackets. So check that out, and obviously they sponsor me too because it's my company. But as far as people who've helped me along the way, you know, all of my coaches, from my very first wrestling coach, his name was Dewey Ivey. You know, my high school coach, his name was Ricky Stewart. My first judo coach, Paul Thomas, who also showed me a lot of jiu-jitsu. And then, of course, the man that I'm with today, the legend, you know, Professor Draculino, has showed me an incredible amount of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. I've had a relationship with him on the mats for about 10, 11 years. And, you know, after, you know, now I'm actually working at his academy and working personally with him. It's an awesome experience. I have a great training partner here. Well, the whole team is great, but there's another black belt here. His name is Pablo Silva. He's a 2010 black belt world champion at light feather, and so he's an awesome training partner and a really great resource to have at the school. So I want to thank all of those coaches, as well as, everybody at Gracie Bot, Texas, my team. And then also I have some sponsors that really, really help me out. One of them is a close friend of mine. His name is Lance Campbell, and he runs Campbell's Compounding Pharmacy, who makes some amazing supplements, and he does a lot of hormone therapy, not for me, but for his business. So I want to thank Campbell's Compounding Pharmacy, as well as I want to thank Awano International and John Awano for hooking me up with a lot of really great gear. If you need a new gi, new rash guard, new shorts, check out Awano International.
Yeah, I've had their stuff. It's really good.
Yeah, they've been around for a long time, and John's a black belt. I think he's like 3-stripe black belt. He's been training for a long time. He definitely knows how to make a great gi, and he knows about the demands of hard training. So if you want to get some good gear, check it out. And the last sponsor I want to thank is a clothing company. It's called House of Daggers Limited Supply Company, and they always hook me up with some pretty nice gear to style around town. So thank you to everybody that's helped me along the way. If I forgot you, I'm sorry. And thank you as well, Stephan, for having me on the show.
Well, thank you for coming on, Brandon. I can speak for my readership and my listenership. We wish you the best, and you've made a whole bunch of new fans. So good luck with your competition and your career and your path in jiu-jitsu.
Thanks, Stephan. I really appreciate it.
Podcast listeners, if you're listening, there's a good chance that you're into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I hope that you are. It's the best martial art out there. But nevertheless, if you do Jiu-Jitsu, if you do grappling, if you do MMA, I've got a book out there. It's called A Roadmap to BJJ, and it covers the fundamentals of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It covers the techniques and the positions. It's got checklists. It's a super useful resource, and it's completely free. If you go to grapplearts.com/book, you can download it. It's also on Amazon Kindle where you can buy it if you want to go that way, but I'm going to suggest the free route, which is grapplearts.com/book. Check it out. I get feedback almost every day from people who found this super useful in finally getting through and understanding the ground game, and it finally making sense for them, and it finally not being so intimidating anymore. Check it out. I think you'll find it really useful too.